Good afternoon, everyone. I know at this moment you were thinking you were going to be at lunch, but I'm going to feed something besides your stomach. Hopefully I feed your soul. So when I start talks, I always want to call out residents that are creating change within our communities. Because many times when we look in the media and we read stories and we look on social media and all these different areas, talk to our friends, we talk about many of the issues in our society in a very siloed way. We talk about it as if it's the first time it's ever happened. And the reality is that these are common occurrences. And there are people on the ground every day doing work to make society better for all of us. And so I always want to dedicate my talk to those individuals. And one thing I want to say that I'm very intentional about is I want to have inclusive language. And so, for instance, in this slide, you see I say for residents opposed to for citizens. Because at my company, I work with Black and Latinx populations, and not everyone has that privilege of being a citizen. And so we have to even think about how can we be inclusive with our language, and in turn, how are we being exclusive with our language and the work that we're doing. It's about being as intentional as possible. So I want to start with, I feel like this should be easy for this group. By show of hands, how many people in this room would like to change the world? Oh, you all have A's, congratulations. Now, by show of hands, how many people in this room feel that they're currently doing that? About half and half. And I'll admit, this is normal. Every time I ask the question, I have the entire room like, yes, the world has problems, I want to do something about it. And then at the time I ask the question, that half start going down. It's like, maybe, I'm not sure. And what's interesting about this is that many times we think of changing the world in a very grandiose way. It's what we need to do. That's how we change it. But the reality is that every single action, everything that we do is changing the world. The question we really need to ask ourselves are we changing it for the better with our actions? And if not, what are we going to do about that? So this is an example of a small action that happened around the incident in Paris. This is an artist named Jean Julien, and he felt disheartened, disencouraged about what was happening. And so he just went to Instagram, drew a quick illustration, and put it up. For him, he wasn't trying to create a movement. He was just trying to do something to express his feelings. But this small action allowed us to heal collectively together. It showed the power of art. It showed the power of design. It showed the power of sometimes just doing small acts and that drop in a bucket and how it really can create impact. Now, what I like to talk about a lot is design and art, and no, they are not interchangeable no matter how many times people like to say it. But the thing about design and art and any form of creative practice is that they allow us to connect to our souls. They allow human connection, but yet as a society, we are okay with being consumers of it, but yet not really understand the power of it. And so how do we bring more value into these creative sectors, into the work that we're doing? So for me, I like to think about things through a lens of mission. I talked quickly about art design, which I'll talk about more, but everyone in here has different crafts. Everyone in here has different talents. And with all the things that's going around, we need a lot of missions. But you have to determine what your mission is going to be. I cannot dictate that for you. My talk is going to talk a lot around racial equity because that's the work that I work within. But the reality is we have many inequities within this world. And so what's your mission? And how are you going to create change around that? So my mission is very simple, 3 words: challenge, champion, and change. Now, honestly, I prefer the term transformation, but it didn't fit into my C's. So I stuck with change. But for me, I'm looking at how do I challenge the status quo? And not just challenge it in one-off occurrences, but actually become a champion of it through my journey, through my life, and then ultimately lead to change, transformation. And so that continually drives the work that I'm doing, whether it's around racial inequities, whether it's around inequities in general, whether it's around human rights inequalities. But I didn't start there. This is a picture of me, and I will be honest, you're the first people to actually see these pictures because I hide them. And here's why. Because I'm going to speak fact and I'm going to speak truth. Going through this journey, many people like to ask me the question of what's the one lesson that you've learned? And many times they're expecting some technical response, oh, I've learned to become a strong entrepreneur, I've learned money management. But what I actually learned was that I was a product of self and cultural hate because that's what I was taught. I was taught to assimilate. I was taught to conform. I was taught through language usage, in education, in history, in media, that I was not good enough, that being in poverty was an issue. But that is part of who I am, that is part of my being, and one of the things that I've appreciated now is that I am happy being an African-American woman. But yet it took me a while to get there. Thank you. So these are photos of me in high school. I didn't know that I would be doing the work that I'm doing today. Honestly, I grew up in a household where making $19,000 a year was the goal. I thought that was a lot of money. I didn't know I was in poverty. It's like asking a fish, hey, how's that water? You have no idea that you don't have the same access, the same opportunities as others. I was a first-generation college student. Neither one of my parents even graduated from high school. So I had to navigate all of this myself. But yet one thing that was instilled in me by my grandparents was that you can do what you want to do. It may be harder, but you have to strive towards it. And now here I am today on stages such as this, leading a nonprofit, being named one of the 100 most woke women by Essence magazine. Thank you. And it's because I allowed myself to be true and I allowed myself to be vulnerable. And it's also because I started to recognize the truth of the society that we live in. And the truth is that we live in systems of oppression, injustices, and inequities. And the reality is that they are by design. Now, we again like to think of them as individual occurrences, but when you have statistics such as blacks being incarcerated 5 times the rate of whites and Latinx populations being incarcerated 2 times the rate, or in my city, which St. Louis, Missouri, we are the 6th most segregated city in the country. We were number 5. I'm not sure if someone got worse or we got better. But in that city, the lowest income neighborhood that's majority African American, the highest income neighborhood that's majority white, there's an 18-year life expectancy gap. Or if you want to talk about the racial wealth divide, it will take blacks 228 years to accumulate the same amount of wealth as whites. That is 17 years shy of slavery. It would take the Latinx population to the year 2097. These are designs. And until we acknowledge that they're designs, we're going to continue to go on this hamster wheel. And so myself and my company, we think about it through this lens and say, well, if they're designs, how do we use intentional design to dismantle them? And so that's what we do. But I didn't start there. I went the traditional route. I worked in marketing advertising for almost 10 years. I did the agency route, I did corporate, I did in-house, I did higher education, and ultimately ended at a position at a nonprofit called Diversity Awareness Partnership. And at this organization, I came in with 2 goals. One, thinking about how do you design diversity visually? Because when you Google diversity, you either see a color spectrum, or you see multiculturalism, or you see, honestly, the posed stock photos. But yet diversity is so much more than that. There's so many different identities that needs to be brought out, and so I wanted to think about how do we depict this visually. But then I also wanted to think about how do you design diversity through human connection? And so I started to partner with the director of diversity and inclusion, and we actually co-created trainings together. which was unheard of in that space. But me being a person that I am, I'm never satisfied with doing things that I'm told to do within an office. And so I started to do other projects. This project was called the 52 TEDs Project. Show of hands, how many people have heard of TED? So a little known fact, where I grew up, TED was your cousin. It was not an institution. And when you think about what TED stands for, it stands for innovation, it stands for change, it stands for forward thinking. When you have a majority of the population that don't have access to this information, this is a flawed approach. And so I started to look at TED Talks and say, how do I take this information, distill it into a poster, and actually give it back to a community while overcoming digital divide that many times we don't want to have conversations about? Now, this project, while it was successful, in a sense, TED reached out and was like, we love what you're doing. It ultimately was that. And it was a failure for a few reasons, but two that I'll mention. One, it was a failure because I had already determined what the output was going to be before I even understood what the problem and the stories were. Who's to say that the poster was the best way to actually depict this? Two, I was looking at this through the lens of my vantage point. Who's to say the community even cared about what I was watching? And so this instance taught me the importance of being community-centered in all aspects. Now, when I talk about failure, to me, failure is not a bad thing. It's on a spectrum. The lessons are eternal. And failure for me, I tell people all the time, I live my life through the lens of failure, and they're like, whoa, that's a little deep and weird. But that's because when you live your life through the lens of success, you're only thinking about success. You're not putting a critical eye and saying, how did I fail at this? How do I improve upon what I've done? Because we're not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect idea. And while you may be included in that moment, what about the people that are being excluded in that moment? So it's being very intentional in the work. So one thing I want you to think about is that when you're doing any type of project, any type of program, you need to immerse yourself within it. You need to avoid fishbowl perspective because many times we like to look from the outside in, but we need to get out of our ivory towers. We need to be on the ground. Many people ask, how do you do the work that you do? Well, you build trust. And trust is not just a word. You don't come in with cameras and expect someone to just give you feedback. You come in and actually be a participant in the process. And so I'm very intentional with that. So here's another project that I worked on called the Dear Oppressor Project. This project was different than everything else. It was the first time I really was being more participatory in my engagement. And in this project, it allowed people to write notes to people that have oppressed them. I didn't put labels on different isms. I put just oppression, because oppression comes in many different shapes and forms, and there's times in which we need to have conversations around them. I'm just gonna read one. It's my favorite. And it's, Dear Oppressor, do you know how long I have been constipated? Since the 3rd grade when I learned that women aren't supposed to poop. No farting, it's gross. Women, let it rip, take a shit, and do it in public. Be hairy if you want, and embrace your blood, it's miraculous. So we had responses that were humorous, we had responses that were serious, we had responses that honestly showed that we do not listen to our youth enough, because they have great ideas and they're also going through a lot. And so in this instance, it really was about how do we build community by sharing things in our deep, dark nature and making sure it's anonymous, because I also want to be respectful of where people are coming from. But that's not the only thing I'm going to talk about today. August 9th, 2014, anyone know what date that is? I'm going to give you a guess, a clue. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. Oh, Ferguson? Uh-huh. So August 9, 2014 was the day that Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed in a community, laid out in the middle of the street for 4.5 hours without any governmental assistance, and his mother and his parents was not able to get to him. This was a day that started a revolt, a revolution, an unrest, whatever word you want to use within our community. This was the day in which part of the community said, I am tired of you looking over us. And what's interesting about this is that in 2014, that was the same year St. Louis was celebrating our 250th birthday. So there was a lot of galas. There was a lot of public awareness campaigns. There was a lot of celebrations saying we've been great for 250 years. Just think what we're going to be 250 years from now. And this showed us and was a stark reminder that great for how many people? And how do we be more intentional around it? And so at that time, I started to ask the question of how should we respond? Because many of us were asking this question on the ground. There were a lot of convenings, there were a lot of conversations, and yet people were very frustrated that we were seemingly going through the same track. And then I started to ask the question of how should or why should designers and creative practitioners respond? And the reason why I was directly looking at designers is because when you really think about our society, we like to use the term innovation, but design is the invisible innovation. When you think about what's around us, literally the clothes we're wearing, where we're sitting, how we walk down the street, even the social constructs in our world have been designed. And so if we're building something out of nothing every single day, how do we get designers into the space of thinking about these complexities of social justice issues? And so my first thing I wanted to do was a 24-hour challenge. Yes, it was 4 p.m. to 4 p.m. They did not sleep. I did. I'm selfish like that. And in that moment, I wanted to make sure that I brought in elements of collaboration, and I also wanted to make sure that I brought in elements of engagement and being participatory. And so when we came together, there were 12 designers, and I use designers very loosely. Designers in this case were actual trained designers, technologists, as well as activists. They were together 24 hours. They came up with over 60 ideas, and ultimately worked on 5 projects and came out with 5 projects throughout the night. All 5 were implemented into St. Louis within a year, and 3 are still active to this day. Thank you. So I'm gonna quickly go through them and give high-level insight of the thought around this. And so this project here is called Cards Against Brutality. How many people have heard of Cards Against Humanity? More people that's changing the world right now. We're gonna work on that, okay? So Cards Against Brutality is different. Cards Against Brutality was looking at this idea of media narration and framing and how we like to victim blame within our communications and use terms like thugs to divide us within our community. It was an educational tool that was used by high schools and colleges and actually still continue to be used to this day. Then we had Look Beyond Your Fear. This project was looking at the idea of a culture of fear, which there's actual data around. There's data supporting a culture of fear of Black males. You're more likely to cross the street. You're more likely to clutch your purse. You're more than likely to lean closer to the elevator door if you're around African-American males. And so they wanted to have us have a conversation around our fear and how that dictates our actions. This project has expanded beyond just looking at fear of Black males, but looking at fear of political affiliation, fear of legalization of marijuana, fear of capitalism, and really having a conversation on how are we using fear to dictate our actions and actually justify it, and how we need to overcome them. Then we had the Vibe Switch project, in which their mantra or their idea was that stereotypes are stupid. I don't disagree with that. Their thing was that we needed to focus on individuality and actually be proud of who we are as individuals. And while people may give us labels and assign us to certain things, we are not how people define us. For instance, as an African-American woman, people can assume that I love R&B. I do not. It is really slow. I'm more of an electro-pop techno girl. So that's me. That's part of my identity. It's not the only part of my identity. And yet we want to put people into these buckets. How do we allow people to take back their individuality and own it? Then we had Connector for Justice, which this project was around the idea of civic matchmaking. Similar to Match.com, OkCupid, Tinder, opposed to you swiping left or right to find a boo or, whatever you're looking for. This project had the idea of how do we have people come together to come up with ideas in a digital space and people actually swipe left, swipe right to support them in having the ideas come to action. When this project was shut down in November 2014 because it was only for the protest, 762 actions had occurred because of this website. And then lastly, we had the Red Table Project, which their idea was how do we turn strangers into neighbors? Because St. Louis, as I stated, is very segregated, and that includes geographically. And we have a street that now has been coined the Del Mar Divide. BBC did a mini documentary of it in 2012, where on one side of the street you have majority African American, very blighted, boarded up homes. People lived in condemned areas, don't have the same amount of access. I know because my mother lived in one. To the other side of the street, in which you had majority white, a lot of access. You have boutiques, mansions, gated communities, high-end hotels. And I know that because my godmother lives on that side. And this is a major stark reality in St. Louis. And so they wanted to bring people together, not to talk about how do we deal with racism, but how do we learn about each other as neighbors? What's your favorite type of ice cream? Simple questions such as that, zodiac signs. And it was around food, because we all like to eat, right? Which you're counting down to right now. But this project was a failure. And not a failure in a large sense, because obviously it catapulted the start of Creative Reaction Lab. We've been asked to do projects such as this around the country. We continue to do so. But we started to realize some of the kind of planning structures that were flawed. One, we fell into the trap of silos and fragmentation. We had generally certain people that thought alike in the same room. So in our upcoming labs and now our programs such as Design to Better Our City, which high school and college youth, we are very intentional in bringing multifaceted people together. And even though I may be shunned in this space, we recognize that human-centered design was not enough. Because when you think about the practice and the creation of it, it doesn't start from a place of equity. And so my group came up with a new practice called equity-centered community design. There's other practices out there, such as liberatory design by Stanford D School and National Equity Project. There's many people that are recognizing that the start of design, how it was created, human-centered design, design thinking, needed to have a different shift around it. For us in particular, we look at not only inviting diverse co-creators to the table and actually talking about power dynamics and acknowledging that having a president, a Burger King work, and an artist work together is very hard to do. We also talk about the importance of history, the importance of trauma associated with it, and how do we overcome that, the importance of having humility before we can even truly have empathy. And so for us, it is looking at it from a kind of a holistic standpoint. And then ultimately, we decided that we needed to redefine what we meant by design and designers. Because if these social constructs have been by design, that means everyone has the capacity to design. So how do we create a space of inclusion around that? This is one of the tools that we use. I'm not going to go through it, but it's looking at different industries and acknowledging that they all bring area and expertise to the table. For instance, community members are living experts. They know the day-to-day impact of whatever issue you're trying to address, but we also have barriers with communicating with community members. If you ask them, tell me about the school to prison pipeline, they will have no idea what you're talking about majority of the time. But if you ask me, how many times have you been suspended? Or do you have any family members in jail? Not incarcerated, yes, we love our words, but in jail, they'll be able to give you all types of insight. And for us, we're looking at and recognizing that all of these individuals together become the researchers, they become the strategists, they become the teachers, they become the doers. And so with interdisciplinary creative problem solving through civic engagement, through equity-centered approaches, we ultimately lead to that transformation. Yes, I got that T in there. So I'm going to leave today with having you think about how do you become an equity leader, whether it's racial equity, gender equity, ability status equity. How do you become an equity leader, and how do you make sure that your decisions are going to actually impact all of us and improve the world for all of us? So we're all changing the world, but the question again you need to ask yourself, am I changing it for the better? And if not, what are you going to do about it? Thank you. Thank you.